present our Pathmaker to Peace Award to one of the outstanding activists of our, or I would say any era. And we'll say some more about her shortly. I will say briefly about Brooklyn for Peace. This is our 30th anniversary. That is really not unfortunately, that's not an occasion to applaud. What that suggests is that for 30 years, militarism and a large defense budget and a foreign policy based on imperial warfare has dominated our country. Unfortunately, that is still the case as we sit here today. So one of the things we would like to talk about tonight is to figure out ways that we don't have to be here for Brooklyn for Peace's 60th anniversary, because we would like to see a substantial change in the way the United States relates to the rest of the world. Let me, at this point, ask our co-sponsor, the Social Action Committee of the Park Slope Methodist Church, Sandy Stratoon Gonzalez, to say a few words.
Welcome, everybody. It's an honor to be a co-sponsor with Brooklyn for Peace. Our Social Action Committee has a long history working both locally on local and national and international issues. One of the things you might know us for are our film nights. And our next film night is next Friday evening. We have a potluck at 6:45 in the basement and a 7:30 presentation of the film Flow. We've been looking at issues around water, water justice, water scarcity, the pollution of water, and certainly that ties into what our state is experiencing with the decision, hopefully not to open the state to hydrofracking or not to open it any further, as you may know that there's already fracking happening upstate in the Finger Lakes region. The movie after that, another Friday, June 6th, we will be screening Gasland 2, which is Josh Fox's second film, which many of you may already have seen. We invite you to join us on Sunday, and
my co-vice chair, one of the founders of Brooklyn for Peace, a professor of foreign policy, a long-term activist in her own right, Carolyn Rusty Eisenberg, who will present the award. Rusty has been on the National Steering Committee of United for Peace and Justice for
400 years.
Almost as long as Brooklyn for Peace has been around, together with Medea. So let me have Rusty take it from here.
Thank you, David. It's really a pleasure to welcome Medea here to Brooklyn this evening and to extend to her our Pathmaker to Peace Award. I was thinking about tonight, and I was thinking, well, there's probably everybody here, except for the FBI agents, has some positive anecdote or favorite Medea action which brought you here this evening. And I hope everyone will linger for the reception and have a chance to share them. So speaking for myself, I'd like to mention two qualities of our honoree, which I particularly value. And they come under the categories of always popping up and great meeting personality. So I'm popping up. Since 9/11, one of the great trials and tribulations has been watching the endless array of administration figures come on our television screen uttering nonsense. And for the Bush team, it's always a nasty-looking group of evildoers. Then things got a little better in the Obama years because they're more pleasant appearing, but on the other hand, they're usually hypocritical. So watching these things on television, you're always talking to the television and wanting to turn off the television, but then I always get this special rush of joy and anticipation when I see that flash of pink and realize that Medea and her fellow code pinkers are all set to disrupt the occasion. Now, to turn to Medea's meeting personality. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to be with Medea in many national strategy meetings, some that lasted for 2 or 3 days. And, to be truthful, extended meetings of peace lovers are not always that peaceful or that delightful as you might wish. So it's always great to have Medea in the room because she's reliably calm, down to earth, usually sane, and very sensible. So she's salvaged many conversations that were about to go this way with just some common sense. So I'm always happy. And she doesn't really like meetings either, but I'm always happy when she's there. And that brings me to the reason for this evening's award. When we think back to these post-9/11 years and the constantly morphing war on terrorism, it's difficult to think of one individual who has contributed more to the cause of peace than Medea Benjamin. As a co-founder of Code Pink, Medea and her organization have brought humor and imagination to the peace movement. But more than that, through their philosophy of direct action and the courage to confront power directly, they've energized people here in the United States and around the world. In a time when it's easy to feel powerless, Medea shows up and has demonstrated time and again that if you're willing to take risks, you can break the silence and inspire other people to action. A common thread that runs through Medea's work is the interaction with specific people. She reminds us that whether it's the President of the United States, the Director of the CIA, or Senator Hillary Clinton, these people are no larger than life, and some maybe a little smaller, and they can be challenged directly for their behavior. And that same sensibility has underpinned Medea's outreach to the victims of American and Israeli power, whether they live in Iraq, Bahrain, in Gaza, or in Pakistan. She's courageously gone to these places and elsewhere to hear people's stories and to bring these stories, and sometimes the actual people, back here to the United States. Finally, I think, David notwithstanding, I think it's important to recognize that on many issues, Medea and Code Pink have been extremely effective. In 2008, they dramatized the fact that Senator Hillary Clinton was a war hawk, something not widely understood outside New York City. And by so doing, they got the country significantly less ready for Hillary than otherwise. Medea's work on drones as a writer, speaker, demonstrator has made this a major topic of national debate, and by so doing has surely saved many lives. And through her travels in the Middle East, most recently to Cairo, I was sure she was going to like Brooklyn better than Cairo. I was confident of that. And through her travels to the Middle East, she has kept the violations of human rights in Egypt, Israel, and the occupied territories on the agenda of the peace movement. So Medea, for your intelligence, your creativity, your sense of humor, thank heavens, your courage, and above all, your kindness and humanity, Brooklyn for Peace is proud to award you our Pathmakers to Peace Award, if I can pick it up.
All right, so I get the pleasure of chatting with Medea for first half hour or so, and then we're going to open it up for other people to chat, unfortunately, so that you all can join in the discussion with really one of our great figures and a true inspiration. So I will start off by asking Medea to tell us what inspired you a life of political activism.
Well, I'm just going to get on my, a little higher here because it's hard to see all the way back. And can you hear me okay? Yeah. I think, unfortunately, all too many of us come from the Vietnam generation. And that's what, I guess, inspire is a kind of a weird word to use when you talk about war. because war is not very inspiring to me. And in my case, I grew up on Long Island, and my sister, who was 2 years older, it was her cohorts who were getting drafted to go to Vietnam. And I saw what happened to her boyfriend, a healthy, very nice football player who went off to Vietnam and 6 months later sent her the ear of a Viet Cong as a souvenir, showing how proud he was to have killed somebody. And that just turned my life around. I was just shocked to think that how in 6 months could a nice, healthy American guy who was such a positive personality and loved everybody be sent off thousands of miles away and become a killer and be very proud of becoming a killer. So I was so shocked that I really said to myself at that time, I'm going to work to make sure that nobody thinks that a body part of some other human being is a positive thing to brag about and to wear around your neck. So that was my first. I'm also a product of New York in the sense that I went to school at both Columbia University and the New School for Social Research. And I learned a lot studying political economy in the New School. But I must say that it really wasn't the reading of the Gundrisa that made me decide to devote my life to social justice. And reading the works of Marx and Engels and Lenin was interesting. But I think, Rusty, when you talked in the intro, for me, I'm more of a people person. And so it was going actually out in the world as a young woman, getting a job at a young age for the United Nations, and seeing the way that corporations were using their wily ways to get very poor people to become even poorer, made me really think very deeply about the role of both our government in terms of its politics and the economics. And just to give an example, I was in Southern Africa, and this was the time when the companies that were selling powdered milk to women were going into the villages dressed as doctors and nurses, telling these very, very poor women that their children's lives would be infinitely better if they just stopped that old-fashioned practice of breastfeeding and instead fed their children this powdered milk, this kind of miracle thing. And those of you who remember that campaign, you might remember that it led to women using contaminated water that led to diarrhea among the children, and also their breast milk drying up and not having money to keep buying the powdered milk. Well, I was there on the end of seeing the results of that, which is literally having babies in my arms dying. And when you have a baby die in your arm day after day, if you've got half a conscience, you're going to start questioning why it happened. And it led me to starting to protest against those companies. And unfortunately, we didn't have the internet in those days, and I couldn't look up who else cared about this. I thought I was the only one in the whole world who cared about this. And through my own activism, hooked up with other people and became part of that campaign to get the first international code of conduct for multinational corporations. And I would just say on that, to me, it brought together the political and the economic issues, but it also made me, on the one hand, very angry that companies would see the poorest of the poor as a way to make an extra penny and wanting to squeeze them so much, knowing their children would die, to get more profits. And yet, on the other hand, it made me realize that people who are organized and mobilized and outraged could make change in the world, and that was a very positive lesson to learn as a young woman.
Can you talk a little bit about why you think you've gravitated more towards activism as opposed to a more academic or, what should I say, bureaucratic career?
Is it possible to actually have Medea stand?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right.
I know. One of the problems of being short. So the
Do you like something to hide behind?
no, that's okay.
Okay.
So the question of what led me to activism as opposed to academia. Well, in my case, I never really wanted to be in academia, but I did think working for big institutions like I got a job at the United Nations would be a way to go. And I also had a very brief stint with USAID. I tend to get kicked out of places a lot. So I was kicked out of USAID because I did a study on, in Guatemala, this is during the 80s, on the use of US food aid. And the study showed that it was being used for counterinsurgency. And when I wrote that up, I got fired. When I worked for the United Nations, my first job was in Mozambique. Mozambique had just liberated itself through a long and very difficult struggle and was in the throes of a beautiful revolution. And I came working for the Food and Agriculture Organization as a nutritionist. Well, I wanted to live with the people, live in the poor areas. I was told that it would be unseemly to do that the UN people all had to live in the compound that was for the UN. And in the compound for the UN, they would serve us lobster tails for dinner or steak, and there was a pool for us. And I figured that lobster tail and steak was probably not the diet of the poor people in Mozambique that I was supposed to be working with. And so I went and just walked through the poorest areas I could find and asked somebody if I could live with them, and said, you know, I would pay you to sleep on your floor, which I did until the UN found out. And they said, you cannot do that. That is just not the kind of image we want for UN people. And so I ended up getting fired from there. And so it just it was an evolution of getting fired and fired. But I think that what I saw in working for various institutions that I worked for, that bureaucracy invades everything. Whether it's a government institution or a large nonprofit or academia. And so much of our time is spent trying to move bureaucracies, trying to get okays from boards of directors. And in the meantime, a crisis is a crisis. And it's not going to wait for that bureaucracy to move. So my evolution was one of trying to find how can I react quickly to things without having to be part of a stodgy, difficult process that by the time decisions were made, the crisis had already evolved so far that you couldn't do anything to help.
Could you talk a little bit about how Code Pink was founded and what inspired you to do that?
Well, and I saw the pictures that were responding to 9/11 with the attack on Afghanistan. Like probably most of you here, I was glued to the television. And seeing the bragging of our government about the tremendous new technology we had, the smart bombs, the laser-guided missiles that were only going to kill bad people, I realized that I had to go see for myself. Because I always felt like a person that had to see for myself. And crazily enough, went to Afghanistan just a week after the US bombing campaign started, and didn't even have to get to Afghanistan to find that it wasn't true, because I saw the refugees that were streaming in to Pakistan. And I write about this in the introduction to the book on drones, because the first family I met was a 13-year-old who found herself the head of her family when a U.S. smart bomb hit her home by mistake and killed her mother and two of her younger brothers and sisters. And at 13, suddenly her father became mute, and she had to collect the few belongings they had left and trek across this dangerous terrain to try to go to Pakistan. What hit me so much was that she was the exact same age as my daughter. And I thought, you know, there for the grace of God go I, that my family, just by matter of being born in a different place, I was able to protect my children, and this family wasn't. And the same thing I saw when we went to Iraq before the US bombing started, is that when George Bush really made the announcement after that horrendous show at the UN that they were going to go ahead and bomb Iraq, we had women that were literally clawing at us saying, how are we going to protect our children? We have no way to protect our children. And as a mother, I had no idea what to do, what to say, what to tell them. So Code Pink really grew out of that sense of desperation, that we had so much focus, and rightly so, on every single person who died in the 9/11 attacks, and paying tribute to their beautiful lives that were all cut short, and yet didn't even acknowledge the names or anything of people, innocent people, that we were killing in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so out of that was a group of women who came together acknowledging that. And it's funny that our original meeting was not to talk about the wars. We were a group of environmentalists that were meeting to talk about what do we do about the crisis of the environment. And I still think, if you ask me what's the #1 crisis, it's the crisis of the environment. And yet, here we are all these years having to deal with the crisis of US wars. And we came together as a group of women saying, we must try to do something to stop what we called then the testosterone poisoning of Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, and George Bush. And it seemed like such a poisonous access of evil, maybe, that women's voices had to come out and start putting forth an alternative response.
You've been in some, how shall I say, very perilous situations. Have you ever been afraid, and how do you deal with that?
Well, I think fear is actually a good thing. And if we're not fearful, then we're missing a very human part of ourselves. And I am afraid a lot of times. I'm afraid sometimes on the emotional level that I'm going to be doing the wrong thing, like when I interrupt presidents, whether it's George Bush or Barack Obama. In the case of Obama, because he is so well liked by so many people that I appreciate, there's constantly, when I was in that National Defense University, there was a voice inside me that kept saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, and another voice that's saying, do it, do it, do it, and in all of that is fear, and you know, your heart like thumping like this, like it's going to come out of your chest. That happens to me quite a lot, and it really is sort of meditating and thinking about the people who don't have the opportunity to talk to such powerful individuals that gives me the courage to do it. But then there's also fear on a physical level, and I certainly have had fear on a physical level. I think my most fearful moment was in Pakistan, when I had gone with one other person from Code Pink to support the lawyers' struggle when it was under the rule of General Musharraf, and he was cracking down on the lawyers. And we went there to show that while our government continues to give this government a lot of money, there are American people who actually believe in the rule of law. And we got carjacked and kidnapped at gunpoint by 12 plainclothes policemen with guns, who threw our driver out, beat him up, and our other Pakistani friend, and took us driving at 100 miles an hour to who knows where. Ended up being a very remote police station where we were interrogated And I thought that was going to be the end. But it turned out that little did I know the U.S. Embassy would show up. And according to the Pakistanis, they said, it's not the Pakistani government that wanted you kidnapped, it was your own government. So that makes you feel really confident about your government. So that was one. And then, Rusty, you referred to being in Egypt. And for anybody who doesn't know, I was in Egypt for International Women's Day on March 8th, going to join 99 other women to go to Gaza, where they had put out this call of desperation saying, the world community has forgotten us, please come. And I was the first to arrive in our group trying to set up the logistics for the rest, and was taken aside. And I wasn't afraid in the beginning because I was stupid enough to think that my American passport and being a white older woman would somehow help me to be treated nicely. Well, that worked for the first couple of hours, but it deteriorated after that. And I was calm for about 12 hours until I saw them come into the cell where I'd been detained, and it was 5 very burly, scary-looking guys with handcuffs who said, come with me. And the 3 other women who were in that cell with me said, don't go with them. And it's like I have a choice. So yes, I did get scared, and I ended up being scared for good reason because they were very violent with me, threw me on the floor, I jerked my arm so violently that my arm was dislocated, and when I started to scream from the pain, they took off my scarf and stuffed it into my mouth. And dragged me like that and wouldn't let me go to a hospital to get my arm reset and put me on a plane like that. So there are certainly moments when I'm scared. I was in Bahrain once where they were shooting at us with tear gas canisters, trying to actually hit you with the tear gas canister. You could be killed by a tear gas canister. And so, yes, in many situations, but I always think in those situations that I do have the luxury, the privilege of having a U.S. passport. And in many countries in the world, that is something that gives you the right to usually leave that place. And local people who are fighting for very basic rights don't have that luxury.
Okay, so now you've told us all about yourself. Let's ask you about the peace movement and what you think our priorities need to be over the next immediate period and going forward.
Well, that's a very large question which we need to dissect more. I always have looked at the bright side of things, because if you look at all the negative things, then it's hard to get out of bed in the morning and say, I'm going to fight for justice for another day. On the positive side, I feel that we are in a moment where American people are tired of war, and that is a very positive thing. If you look at the way the population responded when Obama put his red line in the sand around Syria, and there was a uprising that didn't manifest itself in the streets, but manifested itself in the constant calls into Congress and into the White House, and the letters and the grilling of Congress people when they went back to their home districts and went into town hall meetings. That was so powerful that it made Congress people, who are always ready to rubber stamp another war, think twice and decide that they weren't going to okay that. And that led to Obama withdrawing that red line in the sand. And a positive example that we rarely see of stopping a U.S. direct military intervention. Now, it doesn't mean it won't happen even in the same issue around Syria again. But it does mean that the American people across a broad ideological spectrum have voiced their opinion. And they voiced their opinion in opinion polls as well. We see the same issue around Iran, where there are these powerful forces that want to take us to war, and where the American people would rather have diplomacy, and that has given President Obama more leeway to go that route. And I saw a very positive statistic today, which is that the younger generation, which in this article they called the selfie generation, for taking the photos, for the first time ever in the polls that they've taken, more than half of them said that they didn't trust the military to do the right thing. So those are some positive signs. I'm sure we're going to talk about some of the negative ones, but I would say that the job is to build on that. Rusty, you brought up Hillary Clinton, and when I think about what lies ahead with a candidacy and the period of the running for office, and then if she wins, what it's going to be like to build a movement with the first woman president, just as difficult as it has been to build a movement under the first African-American president. So it's going to be very hard, and the world is in crisis in a whole lot of different places. But I would say the job is to build on the sense of the American people that the last 12 years of war have not been good for us.
There's been a lot of talk lately about how the United States has become less and less of a democracy. So could you comment on how, while on the one hand, the peace movement has succeeded in getting a majority of Americans to say that, you know, this all war all the time is not the way we want to go for our foreign policy, and the disconnect between that sentiment and the actual policies of the government?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that we have something like drone warfare, because that's an attempt to continue with the perpetual state of war without the American people knowing about it. And I would like to see some polls, in fact, maybe we should commission them ourselves, about what Americans, how much Americans even know that we are carrying on war by other means through remote control and in countries that we are not, quote, at war with. And I think that it has been a way to pull the wool over our eyes, to pretend that we are killing very few people, to not have the issue of war be in the news very much, because the drone warfare is so secretive. And you might have seen that the last stunt that was pulled was taking out of this bill that was coming out through the Intelligence Committee, the right of us, the American people, to just have some basic statistics of how many people are killed in these drone wars, and the Senate took that out of the bill. So I think one of our jobs is to make these wars more real. Whether it's the drone warfare and lifting the veil of secrecy around that, or whether it's the work that so many people here have been trying to do, which is make more real the deep connections between the amount of money that we spend on war and all the other issues that American people care about. That's been a very tough thing for us to do. We have tried for years and years and have had endless campaigns to make those connections. But I think at a time when there are constant budget cuts and there is so much effort, both in the Democrat and Republican Party, to try to not touch the military budget, we have been more effective as of late to trying to make alliances with other groups that see their budgets being cut, that see the issues they care deeply about being underfunded or not funded at all. And so that's another one of the areas in which I think our work is having an impact and will in the future if we do it better.
What do you think we need to do the work better? I mean, apart from war, which is always the answer to that question. But
well, certainly one of the hardest things about the peace movement is that so many of the people committed to it have been people precisely who came out of the older generation of the Vietnam War, even the World Wars. And it's been very hard to get young people involved. It's been very hard to have it be a more diverse movement. I see some areas of hope there. I don't know, how many of you have participated in the protests that have been happening at the Hancock Air Base, upstate New York? Well, let's give a hand for those people, because that's where some of the drones have been remotely controlled. And last week, I wasn't there, but having seen the pictures and read the quite extensive media coverage that they got, I think that's an example of a good way to go about it, because that group has just done tremendous work of making it an issue in the community and connecting it to local issues. Bringing somebody like Cornel West, who brought out a lot of people in the black community, who was able to make the connections between the racism at home with the stand your ground rules and the killing of young boys like Trayvon Martin with the racism and the racial profiling of the drone wars. And you saw in the visuals that they had would be somebody holding a picture of Trayvon Martin and somebody holding a picture of a 16-year-old in Pakistan or an 18-year-old in Yemen who was killed unjustly. So I think making those kind of connections is very important, and I think we should look at the good models of where groups are doing it and try to build on those models.
Are there other specific goals that you think we ought to be looking at over the next few years?
Well, I mentioned the issue about Hillary Clinton, and that's in the larger context of electoral politics. And electoral politics is just so problematic in this country. I just came yesterday from Costa Rica, and it's always very inspiring to be in a country that has more than 2 parties. I mean, we do have the Green Party and we have the Libertarian Party, but we don't have the rules in place that allow those parties to get significant momentum, to get national positions in the Congress. And in a place like Costa Rica, the third party actually won the election and will now have the presidency and a significant number of seats in the assembly. And it's a progressive party, and the even more left party, which has more communist roots, now has a significant number of people in its assembly. So our system is rigged to the 2 parties, and it makes it very difficult. And I'm so sick and tired, as I'm sure you all are, of the constant lesser of 2 evils and the few choices that we have. And it makes electoral politics, at least for me, just not fun. And especially when it comes to presidential politics. So I think that we really must have learned our lesson with these 5 years of allowing our movements to be deflated for the time that President Obama got elected. I remember a friend of mine who's in the union movement and an African-American leader. When Barack Obama got elected, people asked him, well, shouldn't we give him a honeymoon? And he said, of course we should give him a honeymoon. 24 hours. That was good advice. Unfortunately, way too many people demobilized during these years, and we see the results. I don't think that we can allow ourselves and our communities, our friends, to make the same mistake if we have Hillary Clinton as the next president. So it really is about untethering our movements from political parties and making sure that we convince people that it's not about whether you like or you don't like the person who is in the White House. It's not a question of whether you feel that it's a historic moment for African Americans and for women. They are historic moments, and we should appreciate that. But it also means that we are letting them go into the lion's den without being the countervailing force. And they certainly don't wake up every morning getting a briefing from the peace movement. They wake up every morning and they're briefed by the Pentagon. And so if they don't hear our voices loud and clear, that's the only voice that they will hear.
Okay, I think we should take a quick break there. Back in the back is Ken Diamondstone, who's going to come chat with you about why it's important that you give up your hard-earned cash to support the peace movement.
So I'm not even sure that I need to be up here. You all know why we need to give money to Brooklyn for Peace. We are the voice in Brooklyn of justice, of the 99% of efforts for equity, to keep our libraries, to keep our hospitals. Let me ask you something. How do you feel about some of the names I'm going to mention? Alec, Walmart, Koch brothers, Sheldon Adelson, the 1%, Wall Street, banks, oligarchy. We are moving towards oligarchy. We are moving towards a political system that is controlled by the super powerful. But on the other hand, we have voices such as Amy Goodman. Yay! Elizabeth Warren. Yay! Jim Hightower. Yay! The Center for Constitutional Rights. Bill Moyers. And Medea Benjamin. So here in Brooklyn, we are one of those voices for justice. We are a voice that needs to grow, to counter the voices of oppression. We need to have more legitimacy when we go into the offices of our Congress members and tell them you don't have to take a knee-jerk reaction to the Israel-Palestine conflict. You cannot stop a discussion of BDS at Brooklyn College and try to Shanghai academic freedom. We're there on those issues. You can't undermine the actions of the president when he tries to negotiate a nuclear treaty with Iran. And we stop our Congress members from pushing to get fast track on TPP. So that's what Brooklyn for Peace is about. And we need your money. We need you to give up your money and put your money where your mouth is. So I know that that's a kind of hucksterish approach, but I have a $100 bill, and I'm actually going to...
That's a one.
That's a one.
Oh, shh! Well, I do have one in here. Brand new.
All right.
I want to know how many other people in this room. I have convinced Brooklyn for Peace that not all progressives lack money. There are people in the progressive movement who do have resources. Raise your hand if you can give 100. Come on. One more besides me. I look like a fool if I'm the only one. Yes, another hand. Great. One more. Let's have, yes, one more. Can we have 4 or 5 more? One more. Great. This is going wonderfully. I never thought this would happen. Come on, 1 or 2 more, and then we'll go to 50. All right. Put your names on the list in the back with Molly. You don't have to have the dollars right now, but when you get to the back, add your 50s and your 20s. So thank you very much. We need to add to our legitimacy and to our numbers and to our efforts. Thank you.
Okay, at this point, we'll take questions from you all. Stand up, shout loudly, and I'll repeat them. Okay.
Benjamin, have you ever thought of running for Congress or Senate?
The question was to Medea, have you ever thought of running for Congress or Senate?
Yes, I did in California in the year 2000 for the Green Party. And it was a wonderful experience. I really loved it because it was a chance to go all over the state and meet with people and learn about all kinds of issues. But I knew I wasn't going to win because it was against Dianne Feinstein, who is a fixture. And she doesn't even have to bother to campaign. And when I said the elections are fixed, I mean, boy, that just drove it home for me because there was a Republican who was running against her, and he was a congressman, he was a PhD academic and a lawyer, a very smart guy. In fact, they used to call him the smartest guy in Congress, and he said that's like the tallest building in Kansas. And he and I would debate each other because we couldn't get Dianne Feinstein to come to any of the debates. So we would hold these debates with the empty chair for Dianne Feinstein, but it didn't affect her at all. I mean, she just didn't have to show up. She acted like there was no campaign. And I raised a lot of money. I gave a lot of talks. I had a lot of supporters, but I couldn't make a dent in that. And I think it's important for people to run just because we do affect the debate, we do help move the issues, and some people do win. And I also think it's important to have subcategories of things that you want to do. Like in my campaign, we said, let's create 30 new Green Party chapters in the state during this campaign. And it was nice to have a goal like that, and we actually did it. So I think it's important to run, and I do give support and kudos to people who do it, and I think we should support those people. But as I said, I think we should also make sure that we have lots of energy left over for our non-electoral politics.
Okay, next.
I know that Code Pink supports BDS, this boycott, divestment sanction. What I would like to hear you talk about is academic Israel.
The question was, because Code Pink is known to support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the question was posed to talk about the academic boycott of Israel.
Well, I'm not an academic, and I think there are academics in the room here who could talk about that much better. We, as a group that is not exclusively women, but made up predominantly of women, decided to pick a product that was a cosmetic product, ahava, which means love, but there is no love in ahava because it's made in the settlements. So we have had a very vibrant campaign run by a woman here in New York, Nancy Krikorian, who has done a fabulous job on building that movement all over, not just in the US, but in Europe and other places as well. And we're very much a part of the SodaStream boycott as well. SodaStream, another example of a product that actually is made in a settlement. And because it's just become so popular, I don't understand why, because now they put themselves forward as an example of being green, because you don't have to buy all the bottles of soda, you just buy all this other crap in big bottles and make your own soda instead of turning on the tap and drinking some water. But it's a good campaign around SodaStream. So for those, and I know Rusty, you're part of this, so maybe you could answer the question about the academic boycott.
Do you want to?
Well, I'm just speaking personally. Brooklyn for Peace supports the academic boycott.
Do you want to take the? No.
I actually don't want to leave it back to you because that'll start a very complicated debate. I personally am not in support of the academic boycott, and I think that particularly for left academics, that there are principles of academic freedom that are very important and that are really essential for our own organizing. And so, this is not the position of Brooklyn for Peace, but it is my position that I think we need to defend academic freedom. We should focus on the situation of Palestinian academics there and also focus on the effort in American universities and schools to suppress discussion about Israel-Palestine. I think that's a more productive way to go.
Well, and certainly we can say that we must stand up for the right of students and faculty members to support the BDS movement. And the attempts at legislation in places like New York are just despicable. And it is very important, especially for those students and especially for Muslim students who have really been attacked in places like California, to stand up for their right of free speech and their right to support the BDS movement.
Next question. Yes.
Yes, would you talk a little bit? Yes, would you talk a little bit about what Code Pink is involved with in the environmental movement?
The question was what Code Pink is involved with in the environmental movement.
Well, Code Pink is actually a pretty small organization. A public face is much bigger than we are when you look at how many staff people. I mean, we have 6 staff people in the whole country. You know, 2 of them in Los Angeles, 1 in San Francisco, and 1 in Canada, and 1 in Washington, D.C. And the rest is volunteers. So it's really what the volunteers want to do. We have a volunteer who is solely focused on the anti-fracking movement and guides us in that work, and we support her and her group wholeheartedly in that movement. We have a lot of Code Pink people who are involved in the Keystone XL pipeline, and every time there's a big mobilization, we certainly put that out and encourage people on our list to attend. We were part of the Cowboys and Indian mobilization that happened in Washington, D.C. last week. And so it really is what the members want to do, and a lot of times it's what's happening in their area that has moved them, like in the upstate New York area around fracking, or Colorado. So out of the national office, we have our hands full focusing on the issues like Iran, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Egypt now, those kinds of issues directly related to U.S. militarism and war. But as I said, when I talked about the origin of Code Pink, we come out of the environmental movement, and we really do feel that that is the national security issue of our day.
Well, let me just say that Brooklyn for Peace has an active environmental committee that's trying to draw some of the links between the various environmental struggles, including the local struggles around things like the Rockaway Pipeline, and the larger issues of foreign policy that are being driven by a military need to secure the Middle East for big oil. Okay, next question, please.
Do you have any evidence of American or Israeli involvement in the overthrow of the Morsi government in Egypt?
The question was whether there's any evidence of U.S. or Israeli involvement in the overthrow of the Morsi government.
You know, it's interesting you should bring that up, because I just read an article on the bus that I was taking here from Washington, D.C. about how AIPAC was overtly calling for a resumption of U.S. aid to Egypt. And I hadn't seen that and really want to look into that, because AIPAC, the lobby group for the Israeli government, works in mostly subdued ways, that their work is through lobbying, usually more quiet, and I'm anxious to find out their public statements around this. In terms of their any evidence, I don't have it, but I'm sure that it is there. We're one to have access to that kind of secret information, and hopefully there'll be another WikiLeaks type leak that would show that. And you just have to look now at Israel certainly was very hostile to the Morsi government. Israel felt threatened by Muslim Brotherhood right next door, and Israel, I think, was putting pressure on the United States to be supportive of the coup. But having evidence of that, I don't have. You might have, people kept asking me what happened to our trip when we were going there, when we had the okay of the Egyptian government to go through Egypt into Gaza, and suddenly when we got there, everything had changed. And the only thing we could think of is Israel. Who else would have stood up and said to the Egyptian government, you can't let them in? Look at the boat that just was supposed to be setting sail, the Gaza's Ark, and was just blown up. Do we have evidence that it's Israel? No. Would you like to place a bet that it was Israel? I think you'd be making a pretty good bet.
Next question, please. That's it? People want to get to cake and coffee that urgently? Oh, there we go.
Why do you think war is wrong?
Good question. Why do you think war is wrong?
I think as human beings, we are really meant to love each other and not to kill each other. And I think that it has to be programmed into us to kill each other. If you look at studies that were even done on World War II, they show that soldiers didn't want, and World War I, they didn't want to shoot. And they tried not to when they could get away with it. People have to be conditioned to hate. And that's what is part of military training. I think I mentioned that I was just in Costa Rica. It's a country that abolished its military in 1948 under the larger discussion nationwide of do we want to send our young people into war? And as a country, they said no. They said we have better uses for our children and we have better uses for our money. And that has been an example over the years, especially when Central America was in such turmoil and extermination, genocide really of indigenous peoples, that Costa Rica managed to stay out of that. And you see that it's a country that is much better off than any of the other countries because they didn't kill each other and they didn't spend all that money on war. But we were there as part of a group that was saying that they shouldn't be sending their police to be trained at the School of the Americas, because at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, for decades, our government taught soldiers and ranking officials how to torture, how to kill, how to hate. And the Costa Ricans say, we want our police to be friendly with the people and not to be taught how to hate. And I was there with Colonel Ann Wright, and she said, do you know who's teaching in these military academies now? It's people who returned from Afghanistan and Iraq. It's people who were breaking down the doors of local people, who were scaring families to death in the middle of the night, who were taking people away without evidence, who were killing people, and who have been conditioned to hate. And do you want those to be teaching your police? And we see now in this country the terrible militarization of our police forces and how our police are being trained in hate, in tactics that are warlike tactics, in breaking down doors in the middle of the night, in the kind of uniforms they wear, the weapons they carry, the tanks that are making their way into our police forces, and the drones that will be making their way into the police forces. And so I think when you look at war, we have to see it as Smedley Butler did, which is it's a big racket. It's a racket for companies that make a lot of money from the killing and suffering of not only the soldiers who are oftentimes dragged into those wars, but of the populations that have to bear the burden of that. And mostly that is women and children. So I think we should take heart from the people who throughout history have been trying to stop wars, whether it's the beautiful Mother's Day proclamation that I just love reading every Mother's Day. There's a call for disarmament, not a call for Hallmark cards and flowers and breakfast in bed. It's a call for women to rise up and say, disarm, disarm. We did not create our children to be killing other women's children. Or even the beautiful anthem that you see from World War I that came from the pacifist movement that said the same thing, that we did not raise our children to be soldiers. So I think our natural instincts as human beings is to have compassion and love for each other, and we just have to stop the war machine.